Hello and welcome to RUSI. My name is Neil Melvin and I'm the Director of International Security Studies. It's hard to turn on the news these days without the sense that many of the certainties of the international security environment of past decades are fast ebbing away. The foundations of the order that was created with the end of the Cold War are facing major challenges, but even key elements of the post-World War II international settlement, notably regarding the United Nations, are under pressure. There is growing geopolitical competition, a proliferation of threats, an increase in conflicts, and also rising military tensions. This is having far-reaching impacts on international relations, but also on markets and investment decisions. A core change is accelerating competition between the United States and China, as well as the rising activism of regional and middle powers such as Russia, Turkey, Iran, the Gulf states, and India. Often these rivalries are playing out in key regions such as the Middle East, Eastern Europe, Africa, and the Indo-Pacific, where armed non-state actors and terrorist groups are also often present. We're also seeing a growing struggle linked to emerging technologies, supply chains, growing disinformation, and even competition in the area of health triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as intensifying debates around norms and standards. Against this background, major questions are being asked about the effectiveness of existing multilateral forms of governance as a means to respond to the changed international environment. But while international security is clearly in transformation, the character of that change and where it is leading are far from certain. Today's webinar is designed to explore some of the major developments shaping contemporary international security. It is also the occasion when RUSI is launching an initiative to explore and understand these changes. The International Security and Transformation Initiative is designed to examine key developments through an integrated set of activities, including the establishment of 4 new regional programs at RUSI. The Navigating the Indo-Pacific program will research and analyze what is fast becoming the leading global security region. The Unpacking the Middle East and North Africa program will examine the fast-shifting regional dynamics of this key region. While the Russia and the World program will consider Russia as an international actor in regard to its neighboring territories and states, but also as Moscow increasingly looks to be a global actor. And finally, the Africa in Perspective program will look at the emerging conflict and security agenda in Sub-Saharan Africa. We will also be focusing on the implications of all of these changes for the United Kingdom and how it can best navigate this fast shifting environment. Today's webinar is organized into 3 parts. In the first session, RUSI's new chair, Sir David Lidington, will reflect on the emerging challenges of international security, and in particular, how this affects the United Kingdom as it seeks to chart a post-Brexit course. In the second session, the RUSI International Securities team will explore some of the major issues driving the current changes in international security and how these are affecting developments in key security regions around the globe. In the concluding session, General David Petraeus will address the central role of the United States in these changes and share his perspective on how the US is looking to shape international security going forward, as well as how the upcoming United States presidential elections will likely affect this agenda. Today's webinar represents the beginning of a discussion that RUSI will be supporting going forward through a series of publications and webinars. If you would like to learn more about this initiative and the new RUSI regional security programs, please visit the International Security Studies webpage on the RUSI site and sign up to receive our new newsletter. Now I'd like to invite my colleague, Professor Malcolm Chalmers, Deputy Director General of RUSI, to chair the first session.
Neil, thank you so much for that introduction. It's my great pleasure to welcome Sir David Lidington into this, leading us in this next session. It's the first time that Sir David has spoken at a RUSI event since he became our chair in July, and I think it's a particularly appropriate event for him to speak at. because it addresses a series of issues which he knows very well from his time as a minister in the FCO. Indeed, he's the longest serving minister for Europe our country has ever had, serving in that role with distinction between 2010 and 2016. Very few of our political leaders have such intense networks across Europe and beyond on the issues we are talking about today. And he, since that time, he also held a number of other senior posts, not least Deputy to Prime Minister Theresa May, at a critical moment in our national debates, and if I may say so, remained a calm voice of reason at a time when many around him perhaps were in danger of not being so. So he's very, very, very well qualified for this discussion. The format of this period is where he and I are going to be in conversation for around 15 minutes, addressing the topics which Neil introduced, and then there will be around 10 minutes for questions and answers. And for that latter part of the session, please do write your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll try to get in as many as I can. I think we've already got one question in that format. So, Sir David, I wanted to start with threats to the UK and threats to the UK and its allies. And one of the emerging messages from much of the discourse that we hear at RUSI is that even in the last 5 years, there's been a trend towards more emphasis on major powers as a potential source of threat. China, as well as Russia. If 2015 was the Russian highlighted SDSR immediately after the invasion of Crimea, and now we're talking about China, but they're both put in the same box of major power threats. And non-state threats, particularly terrorism, maybe are seen as a bit less existential, still there, but less important. So my question is really, in part, is that shift right? How far should we be thinking more about major powers, less about other threats? And I wanted, if I may, to link that spectrum. Is that a matter of degree or something bigger? I wanted to link that spectrum to a related issue. When we talk about the agenda for international security, especially when we come on to talk about the Middle East or Africa, the other regions we are talking about in the next session, how far do we also have to factor in what used to be called non-traditional threats, the impact of technology, the challenges of dealing with global problems like pandemics? It's a whole massive agenda. How do you make sense? How did you as a minister make sense of having to juggle all those different balls at once and still come out with workable policies? So David.
Malcolm, thank you very much. I think that let's deal straight with the question you put to me about where are the threats going to come from. I think my view would be that there was a brief moment in history where it became fashionable to say that traditional sort of hostile state threats had, if not gone away, they had diminished. You know, Russia was both economically weak and still has sort of major structural economic problems, but also was still undecided about whether it was going to move, as had been hoped after 1989-90, more towards a friendly relationship with the West. And China, you know, we were still talking about China in terms of the economic relationship. And I think the general assumption amongst most Western policymakers was that China was going to pursue a policy of non-intervention, did not see itself as in any sort of conflict, in a resurgence of threat. I think if you look at Russia, we have a lengthening catalogue now of Russian interventions and attempted interventions, which seem, it's as they have a pattern to them of being designed to restore Russia's greatness and Russia's agency as a player in global events, and to, as President Putin might well see it, put right the wrong of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the sphere of influence that Soviet Russia had enjoyed. So we saw that back in 2008 in Georgia. We've seen it more recently in Crimea and in the Donbass. And the Donbass, I think, particularly significant because there we've seen Russia rehearse a practice of hybrid conflict, drawing in conventional sort of military intervention with the use of proxies, particularly mercenaries, with the use of intelligence and disinformation, with the use of cultural influences such as the Orthodox Church and an appeal to sort of Slav and to Russian-speaking solidarity, to the use of economic weapons, such as the gas supply, which was switched off to some of the Central European countries briefly, the imposition of restrictions on Moldovan and Georgian wine sales into Russia, Lithuanian dairy products treated the same way for a bit. Just a reminder to those countries that if they annoy Russia, then there are consequences. And I could go on. The Western Balkans, we've seen Russia continuing to try to exert influence in Serbia, in Republika Srpska, in Macedonia, in Montenegro, and even in some of the Central European countries, the way in which they've sought to develop a civil nuclear power relationship with Hungary, for example, the relationship they've had with particularly some of the forces on the left of politics in Bulgaria. There's a pattern, and more recently, of course, Syria, and that is very pertinent to the tensions that we're now seeing in the Eastern Mediterranean more generally, which touch very much upon UK national interests. China, different. I think though China and Russia may be allies of convenience, I think we've got to look at them as distinct entities with their own interests. And China, I think there has been a change in the last few years. We have seen a more aggressive, more coercive diplomacy by China to exert its own interests. And when a country has done something that the Chinese don't like, whether that's meeting the Dalai Lama or saying something about Hong Kong, they use influence, and certainly in particularly their own, as they would see it, their own region of the world, the build up of a military presence on the various disputed islets in the South China and East China Seas, I think is a very telling illustration of Chinese assertiveness, and similarly what we've seen this year in Ladakh, where China openly challenging India in a way that we haven't seen for quite a long time. So traditional state actors, yes, but the non-state actors haven't gone away. I suspect that if you polled people out in the street outside RUSI offices, you'd find that most people would cite terrorism as a greater threat than Russia or China on their list of what they thought might affect them. We've also got extremism, which fosters terrorism, and we have serious and organized crime of all sorts. Talk to any chief constable in the UK, and he or she will say that there is almost no serious and organized crime now that lacks an international aspect to it. And then you rightly drew attention to the other element, the sort of like the third sort of element here, which is those developments in our world which are capable of having a profound impact on our security. Zoonotic diseases and the risk of pandemics is one that's going to be very much in our minds at the moment. But another would be climate change, which is certainly contributing towards greater political instability in parts of the world. And I think will aggravate some of the tensions already there over things like water supply. I think then you could add to that what is happening with technology. I mean, the technological changes are shaking up so many of our assumptions about work and career prospects, and also about, the rather comfortable supremacy that we felt we enjoyed in the developed Western world. And you can't separate any of these broader underlying economic or technological or societal changes from a consideration of security policy. China has very deliberately, makes no secret of it, set out to gain supremacy and a position of global leadership in certain key technologies. A lot of focus on G5 recently, but artificial intelligence is one where China has set out to try to establish a dominant global position. We've seen how, again, China in particular has tried to assert a not quite calling the market, but domination of the market in rare earths. It's of course absolutely vital for the sort of technology that we are all relying on these days. Any defense specialist will tell you in far more detail than I possibly could about the opportunities presented by the miniaturization of defense technology, but that also poses threats to us. If you can arm a drone that is the size of a small bird and send that to try to carry out an assassination or to drop a piece of lethal freight somewhere where you can cause damage, and that is something different that we're going to have to think about. So I think that we'd have to bear in mind states, non-state actors, underlying trends, but also the fact that all of these are interconnected. I've described them as sort of three different elements, but actually the threats to our security will present themselves as a mix of all three.
Thank you very much, David. And before I follow that up, I've been asked to say your microphone is rubbing against your jacket.
All right, okay. Let's try to hold that apart.
Answering.
That's fine.
But
that's fine.
The UK response. I mean, we're nearing the end now of an integrated review, and at the centre of any strategy, of course, is choices. So choices about attention, choices about resources. And I'm very struck by you've given an impressive list of things we should be worrying about, and I would agree with every single one of them. What's not so clear is how do we decide how to prioritize dealing with some rather than others, or doing a little bit more on X by doing a little bit less on Y. It may be that to deal with organized crime, we need to do more with our police, MI5, but maybe to deal with China, it's a rather different bundle of capabilities we need to prioritize. So give us a sense of whether you think our prioritization needs to change in a period, of course, in which we're looking at shrinking resources for government as a result of the pandemic.
We're going to have to change it. We're also going to have to keep our priorities under constant review, because the speed at which technology is changing, I think, makes that inevitable. And what I hope comes out of the integrated review is, first of all, a clear-eyed and rigorous analysis of where our national interests lie, and following thereafter, a presentation of how we should allocate resources to deliver the capabilities that we think defence and maintenance of those national interests requires. What I really hope we don't get is the sort of, if you like, the stereotype sort of defence review where everybody's working out what to slice away from how we do things at the moment in order to fit with some preordained Treasury figure about what the global sum should be. I think we really do need to look at the evidence and have the policy assessment first. Now, it seems to me what key to this, as part of that analysis, is to ask ourselves, right, what are the things that we have to do ourselves? And what are the things where actually we need to cooperate with others, both because we may not be able to afford to do it on our own, but similarly because there's actually you might get a better result in an interdependent world working with other powers. So to give you a couple of examples. I'm absolutely convinced that we need in the United Kingdom to do more in terms of our own resilience as a society. Without, sort of pointing fingers and sort of, looking for particular details, it's clear there have been elements of the response to COVID that have shown some weaknesses in how we do things. Now, I don't want to go around attributing blame, because even now the top scientists of the world will say that there's a lot they don't know about this disease, and it's easy with hindsight to say that a decision 6 months ago turned out to be the wrong one. It may well have been very reasonable given the state of knowledge at the time. But when I was at the Cabinet Office, when I was doing the #2 job in the government, one of the responsibilities I had was the overall supervision of civil contingency work. And in Whitehall, it is really difficult to get departments at a senior level to focus upon policy responses that are cross-departmental in character. It's only when an emergency actually happens that people really want to take the time, let alone commit the resource to respond. And so I think that we need to do. And that means, for example, giving a much higher priority in our planning to cybersecurity. Government departments are still lagging behind the best of the private sector in how they do that. And government now uses the private sector to deliver a lot of its key services. And one of the things I tried to start doing, I hope we will continue, is efforts to drive up the cybersecurity of the whole supply chain across government now, right down to the subcontractors. And we can't talk about critical national infrastructure now just in terms of a power station or a railway terminus. We are talking about systems now, without which we would find it very difficult to function as a society. We also need to have, in my view, an offensive as well as a defensive capacity in the new technologies. This work, as you know, is already ongoing, but I am lined up in terms of the defense outcomes of this review with those who say that we are going to have to devote more of our defense energy and defense spending to such things as drones, artificial intelligence, robotics, and the like. There's going to be a new generation, and we're having to think about, as a defense secretary would say, about cyber and about space alongside the three more conventional spheres of military defense. And then when it comes to cooperating with others, I think that, again, we need to be clear-headed. We need to do everything we can to keep a close relationship on security with the United States, including trying to bind the United States into seeing the defense of Europe as essential to its own interests. But I think whoever wins in November, that is going to be an increasingly challenging task. I think President Trump has already made clear his impatience with NATO and with what he sees as an inadequate European contribution to security. But I think even if it's Vice President Biden who wins, while he will be somebody who I think has a higher regard for alliances and for international institutions as good things in the world than President Trump does, he will also want to give a priority to China and to the Indo-Pacific. And he will want Europe both to pay more for its defense and to exercise political leadership. We saw it with President Obama over Libya, when the Americans gave material support to the military operation in Libya. But basically, Obama said to David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy, look, you guys are going to have to front this up and take the political lead. This is not one for me or for the United States. And I think we're going to see more of that, particularly when it comes to Africa, but also as energy self-sufficiency means that there's less US skin in some of the Middle Eastern questions as well. So I think part of this is going to be not just a strong relationship with the United States, but I think the UK will need to re-establish over the years to come a new, different, but close partnership with the European Union on defence and international policy. And I'm all in favour of this idea of D10 that the government is coming up with at the moment, to work more with the Australians, more with the Japanese and other democracies. But you can't have a Europe-shaped hole in the middle of it. We'll have to find a way of involving and working with other European countries. And in my view, it needs to be, if it's to serve our interests properly, on a structured, strategic basis, not just a series of sort of ad hoc deals with particular crises as they come up.
So David, very, very interesting response there. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to give you 2 or 3 questions in one big bundle, and if you could just respond to them briefly, that would be great. We've got I think we have 9 questions in the chat. I won't go through all of them, but just the ones. I'll bring some of them together, if I may. There's an interesting question from Mitch Mitchell, who asks, can we still say the China-Russia relationship is one of convenience when their common narrative is that the US's action show it to be the revisionist power, seeking to change the world order in US favor? And then he says, his question really is, do we not need to factor in a growing true strategic partnership with Russia more explicitly into our thinking on China, despite significant differences in interest? So there's a sort of Russia-China, are there ways in which we might have to work with Russia question. A second question, which a number of people are asking about, is how far do we need to think about the linkage between organized crime on the one hand and hostile states on the other? I guess particularly in relation to Russia, but perhaps others as well. And thirdly, all quick-fire questions from Mike Maiden is, how important do you think the E3 is becoming? And maybe do we need to think in terms of our relationship with Europe, and maybe we need to broaden that membership to say 5 or more, given that there are other important European powers. So 3 quick questions.
Right, on China and Russia, they've got an alliance of convenience at the moment, in resisting, what they both see in their different ways as the West trying to design and operate a world order that doesn't take sufficient account of their interests, and as China in particular would say, the historic injustices done to them. But actually, particularly if you're in Moscow, you've got a shrinking population. Actually, the only bits of the Russian population that are growing are those in the North Caucasus Muslim republics. And you've got this huge power to the southeast of you, very close to some potentially quite valuable mineral resources in the Russian Far East, and still with some ancient Chinese claims to bits of what are now parts of Russia. So I think Russia is nervous about China. And when there was a moment a few years ago when Putin flew to see Xi to try and get a deal, and Xi kept him cooling his heels in a hotel for a couple of days before he deigned to see him and agreed to sign whatever agreement it was that they were then negotiating. And I think increasingly as this century goes on, it's going to become very apparent that Russia is the junior partner in any sort of relationship with China. I mean, can we have a strategic partnership with Russia? It's frankly, I think, incredibly difficult while Russia is using the subversive tactics that it is at the moment. Most starkly, a chemical weapons attack that led to the death of a British citizen and to the near deaths and severe illnesses of others. So you can't have a strategic partnership with a country that behaves in that way. So I'm afraid I think we have to wait for and hope that Russia changes and keep saying, look, there is another and better course for you to follow and to maintain, for example, people-to-people contact. On organized crime and hostile state, oh, yes. I'm used to I used to sit with the Home Secretary, and we got a weekly report from the intelligence agencies, the National Cyber Security Center, on hacking operations, others that had gone on, and without saying things I wouldn't be allowed to speak about, there is a blurred line between organized crime and hostile states. I mean, it's known about with Russia, but we've attributed stuff to North Korea as well. And you sometimes find that there are criminal enterprises that seem very close to elements of a hostile state. On the E3, it's an interesting idea. It obviously works with Iran, although, of course, the EU High Representative, particularly when Cathy Ashton had that job, has been a key player in those conversations. I think that I'm certainly not against doing more on an E3 basis, but I think we've also got to acknowledge the reality that for most of the EU member states, there is a deep suspicion of anything that looks like setting up a directory of the big powers to tell the others what to do. And there will be resentment, particularly if France and Germany were seen to be swanning off to do a deal with this non-member state and then come back and tell the rest of them they were supposed to get into line. And I can see some of the other European countries cutting up rough about that. Not just them. I mean, in my experience, conversations with senior German officials and politicians, they are deeply reluctant to break away from the formal EU process of developing common foreign and security policies. So I think that the way forward in terms of a European relationship is to do different things. I think that if we can make E3 work on some issues, great. On others, it may be a coalition of the willing, because you're never going to find it easy to get the unanimity that will be required for a forward-leaning EU position on action. I mean, not just because some countries don't like sending their soldiers abroad, but just for the Baltic states of Poland, it's Russia, it's Belarus, it's Ukraine that are the key issues. For Italy and for Greece, it's much more Mediterranean things that are at the forefront of their mind. They have different priorities. And I think we'll need E3, we will need coalitions of the willing that we can work with and plan with. And we shall also need to have, and be in our interest to have, an institutional relationship with the foreign policy and security policy structures of the European Union, because they are going to continue to exist. And France and Germany and the Netherlands and others are going to carry on this continuous conversation in multiple different forums about the development of EU policies. And we want to try to influence that, be more difficult from outside the tent. And we want to be in the position where we are helping to shape policy outcomes that we're happy to align with. And it doesn't serve anybody's interest, it seems to me, if we're in a situation where we're distant. So they thrash out a common position, they've got unanimity, they come to us and say, well, this is what we're doing, are you with us? And actually, no, we say we don't like clause 6 and clause 12 here. And so it's just too complicated to try to unscramble something it's taken us 6 weeks to get a unanimity over. And so I think you've got to do all things with Europe and work on those different levels simultaneously.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, David. And really, we could continue this conversation for another hour without any problems at all. Can I apologize to those of you who've asked questions, which I haven't had time to put to Sir David? I'm absolutely delighted that Sir David is going to, in his capacity of chair, help us shape our programs at RUSI on international security as we go forward. But as a taster for what RUSI is doing and is planning to do in this area, I'd like now to hand over the chair of this session to Neil Melvin. Neil, over to you.
Hello and welcome to the second session of the RUSI webinar launching our new International Security and Transformation Initiative. Many of the key changes that are reshaping international security, already identified by Sir David Lidington in the previous session, are playing out in key security regions around the world. These regions are emerging as the arenas where the defining security relations of the 21st century are likely to be forged. In this session, we will explore some of the leading developments that are affecting regional security around the world, drawing on the expertise of the RUSI International Security Studies team, who are involved in the 4 new RUSI regional programs that we're launching today, and who will be leading our work, which will be continuing our analysis and discussion of these topics into 2021. I'd like to begin with one of the most important issues for international security today, namely the emergence of state-to-state competition amongst great powers. And then I want to go and look at how this issue is beginning to play out in some of the key security regions around the world. Clearly, China is today a central security actor. Veerle Nouwens is leading the RUSI Indo-Pacific program. Veerle, over the past 12 months, there's been a significant shift in the perception of China as a security actor, as people have grown concerned about China's involvement in emerging technologies, its economic statecraft, its growing military power, territorial disputes. And we've even seen the US Secretary of Defense, Esper, recently describe the Indo-Pacific as the epicenter of a new geopolitical power competition with China. Would you say that we've now reached a tipping point with the rise of China and entered a new era of international security competition defined by a Sino-US bipolar contest focused on the Indo-Pacific?
Thank you, Neil. This is indeed a really important question. And I think that when we think around the Indo-Pacific region, one thing that immediately springs to mind is, of course, US-Sino competition. Now, China has created some level of concern initially amongst regional countries, of course, neighboring countries, but also countries further afield around its actions, both internally in terms of domestic policy and in terms of its foreign policy, most immediately in its immediate neighborhood. Now, when it comes to these policies, there is, of course, a larger, I think, ambition, or at least an indication that China is seeking greater control, both internally and externally, and it's what it thinks is its sphere of influence. And some of the ways in which it has sought to do so is in contradiction to, largely held, internationally held rules and norms. And so when this then manifests itself, for example, in the South China Sea, where we see UNCLOS no longer being respected, this has created immense concerns for implications, not just within the region, but within the wider region of the Indo-Pacific. And this is of great concern, not just to countries, for example, in Southeast Asia, that have to live with a China that is now adopting sometimes more assertive and even aggressive foreign policies, but also countries around the world that see the Indo-Pacific as a region for international global economic growth, a region in which vital lifelines of the region, of the global economy run through, for example, through maritime trade and energy routes. So absolutely, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region, there is a strong focus on the role that China plays and how this interacts with the traditionally held, dominant security role of the United States in this part of the world. Now, the United States has said that the Indo-Pacific is now its priority theater. This, of course, I think does not sit well with China and its own views of the role that it should have in the region, but it's also of concern to countries, for example, in Europe, who see this growing competition within the region with great concern over the potential destabilizing effect that it may have. And so as we look towards this region moving forwards, this will be a key issue for many countries around the world.
China's obviously now, there's a lot of focus on China, but I think if we look at state actors, the other one that people are obviously giving a lot of attention to is Russia. Russia has been advocating for over 2 decades now its own agenda, the agenda that we're moving towards a multipolar world, a world in which Russia, of course, would be one of these major poles. Speaking at the General Assembly last week, Vladimir Putin even proposed the idea of a greater Eurasian partnership as part of his agenda for developing this multipolar international security partnership around the world. I want to go to Emily Ferris, who's leading the Russia and the World program at RUSI. Emily, how is Russia seeking to shape its role as the world begins to change, and we get this new dynamic around great power competition?
Thanks very much, Neil. I mean, I think it's clear that Russia really sees itself as one of the main actors, if not the main actor, in the international security space, and that it sees itself as playing a really important role in defining how new alliances work. So shaping the course of conflicts, reaching out really beyond the post-Soviet space to play important roles all over the world. So this is something that you can see from, say, Russia's leadership of the BRICS countries. You see it in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the way that Russia also brokers relationships with countries in places like Latin America, like Venezuela, and its increasing reach across Africa, which people obviously are increasingly looking at for economic and security as well as political reasons. And then even more recently, you see Russia playing almost a humanitarian role in the manufacturing and dissemination of the Sputnik 5 vaccination for COVID-19. And we can argue, the reasons why Russia involves itself in these kind of alliances. But certainly, if you look at the Middle East, Russia's made it very clear that any major political decisions that happen in the conflict in Syria cannot occur without consultation with Russia. And it's really that position of power that I think Russia is keen to maneuver itself into. So really, within our program at RUSI, I think what we're trying to understand is the way that Russia forms these international alliances. So what the domestic and foreign policy drivers of this policy are, how are these relationships shaped, and why is this actually important for Russia? And I think really what we aim to do is look beyond those headlines and establish Russia's long-term strategic approaches to these countries and these new relationships, as well as really anticipating what challenges that might pose to Russia in future. And I really think this also creates the question about engagement with Russia. How do we engage with Russia, and should we engage with Russia? When occasionally its behaviour on the international stage can be very challenging for us, particularly in the UK. So I think these are the sort of questions that we are asking ourselves and that we hope to kind of grapple with in future.
Alongside the sort of great power politics, the rise of this high-level competition, we're also seeing a parallel process of these relations playing out in a number of key regions around the world. And these are often this competition is often being linked to and leading to localized conflicts, bringing together various actors. We see this particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, which has become the center for precisely this sort of unstable cocktail of competing actors and violence. I want to go now to Anise Tabrizi, who leads the Unpacking the MENA program at RUSI. Anise, why do you think MENA has become an arena for this kind of competition in recent years?
Thank you, Neil. Well, there are certainly several reasons that led to the current situation in the MENA region, but if I had to pick one, I think it would be the progressive disengagement of the US from the Middle East. With the US not as involved as before in local crises, leading negotiation, de-escalating tensions, or even re-establishing deterrence in the region, other countries have been managing to increase their influence in this area, but also to try to take on the role. Emily just now referred to the role that Russia is trying to play in Syria, for instance. So that means that the number of external powers invested in the region has increased over time. And this means different agendas, different interests, but also the connection between different conflicts, not just within the Middle East, but also within different regions as well. Then, if you go at the regional level, we have countries which have grown in terms of ambition, but also ability to project power. So some of them have gone under drastic changes internally, shifted their strategic interests, and that has meant a shift also in foreign policy. Others, I think, they are trying to compensate for the lack of security guarantees which were previously provided by the US. and they have been much more proactive in their engagement in conflicts, but also more fluid in terms of alliances, agreements, and in shifting their position in current conflict. And finally, if you go at the local level, there is the challenges that are linked with weak governances, but also with countries which have gone through difficult processes of war to peace transitions. And in these countries, we have witnessed a proliferation and a strengthening of violent non-state actors, which in many cases don't only pursue domestic agendas, but also are involved in international conflicts as well, which means that it's increasingly difficult to understand what is happening in the region, what are the dynamics of the conflicts in the region. And I think conflicts are more and more intertwined, but also more difficult to solve precisely because of that. So what we are trying to do through the program is to provide a multi-layered analysis, which includes geopolitical factors, but also how domestic and local dynamics are linked to ongoing and emerging conflicts.
That issue of complexity and the sort of the multi-actor aspect of conflict is something that we also see around concerns that this kind of competition and conflict may be spilling into another area, namely Sub-Saharan Africa, which is also connected to the Middle East through the North Africa. So we've seen the Libya conflict beginning to bleed into parts of West Africa. We've also seen growing geopolitics bringing Gulf countries and Egypt into the Horn and East Africa. And these kind of engagements are taking place often against the backdrop of long-standing local conflicts and security issues. They're becoming entangled with them. Dr. Andrew Chi leads our Africa in Perspective program. Andrew, how do you see the key security challenges of Sub-Saharan Africa today?
Thank you very much, Neil. I think across Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, various regions that connect to MENA, as Dr. Nisa has pointed out, the key issue has been that multilateral organizations and institutions have failed to step up and oftentimes failed to resolve existing conflicts. And a lot of the new conflicts that we're seeing emerging because of existing or old trends or patterns are interacting with a lot of the new concepts or Western concepts of security. So oftentimes what you are seeing is international security partners who are partnering up with African countries to try and resolve conflicts, but actually not understanding who the key actors on the ground are. And this is to a large extent exacerbating conflicts that exist, but also exacerbating the weak systems that are already exist in the African space, as it were. And with that is also what I would say is definitely the erosion or the hallowing of old democratic institutions that are not really functional to the way they should be across Africa. So there are institutions that exist, some of them post-colonial independence period, but a lot of them haven't been able to have the right amounts of funds or been able to do the work that they're called to do because of the way politics might exist or because of other interests that are creeping in as well. But I would also say for many Africans or for many Africans in Sub-Saharan Africa, many would argue that they haven't really seen changes. So yes, we see elections, and it's quite ironic because we had an event today on this very same thing. There are elections, and now oftentimes in Africa around election times, people become really angry and violent, and because of who's what. But actually, elections don't seem to solve the issue, because actually what you do have is people are elected in, but nothing changes. And so you're seeing the same pattern. And actually what the argument has been put forward is that the structural systems that were left over from the 60s and 70s really need to be rethinked and really African-led. So what does Africa want? How is it about to achieve that? Not just importing models that oftentimes don't align with their own values, but also don't align with objectives that they can reach and deliver on as well. But I would also argue that the problem with that is that, particularly around elections, is that violence as itself has become more of a legitimate form of political discourse in Africa. And that is a growing concern, not just around elections, but in general. Because people are frustrated, people tend now to use violence as a way of settling political issues, and that's not the way forward.
I want to move on to another issue now, but I think it's linked into this one, which is, around the question of the great powers and their activity and some of these regions that are being affected by that competition. We also have I think, an emerging set of actors, often regional actors, who are having to decide how they will themselves navigate this new international security environment. And are often looking to try to either balance or to align with the new groupings that are emerging. Historically, this has existed before, but I think that this is quite a new dynamic that is emerging as a strong one. I wanted to look here particularly at India, which is a key state in this regard. Historically, India has been a leader of the non-aligned movement. It's now part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But at the same time, it's got growing conflicts with China, and it's looking to move closer to the United States and some of its other allies in the Indo-Pacific. Turning to Aditya Dave, who's leading work on India and South Asia within the new RUSI Navigating the Indo-Pacific program. Aditya, how do you think India is seeking to manage this increasingly complex set of international relations? And can it manage to continue to balance between other major players as some of these issues that we've been talking about already become more acute?
Thanks, Neil. The challenge for India is a little bit different, I think, from other countries in the region, in that in addition to the wider geopolitical context in the region, it also has disputed and volatile land borders with both China and Pakistan. This means that India not only has to allocate resources accordingly, but also that it has to manage a variety of relationships to mitigate these threats. The ongoing Sino-Indian crisis along the border is likely to impact how India proceeds with its relationships. This will impact sort of the trajectory of broader India-China relations, as well as the pace at which India looks to deepen its relationships with other like-minded countries, such as the US and its allies. While India has emphasized its policies, you mentioned, of what it now calls strategic autonomy, where essentially it means that it will align with partners based on specific interests without sort of closing any doors. It is increasingly becoming the case that on key strategic questions, India's interests appear to lie away from or in direct competition to China. This includes issues like maritime security in the Indian Ocean region, strategic competition in South Asia, and the production of new technologies, the last of which might have previously been viewed from an economic or development perspective, but is now increasingly being looked at through a strategic lens. At the same time, China is one of India's largest economic partners, and if there is to be a broader disengagement between the two, this leg of the relationship is likely to serve as an important stabilizer. India also has long-standing ties with Russia, and over half of its defense equipment is of Russian origin. In the past, Russia has been willing to share military technology with India while other countries have not. And so for practical considerations related to its military modernization and maintenance, this engagement will continue. So while there is a clear deepening of India's relationships with the US and its allies, this will likely continue through narrow engagements and issue-based coalitions rather than a firm alignment with one side or another. In this regard, I think more than the Quad itself, I would say that the bilateral and trilateral frameworks that the Quad has facilitated, including ones that don't include countries in the Quad initially, such as the recently launched India-France-Australia trilateral, or the numerous military logistics agreements that India has signed with countries in the Indo-Pacific, I think these are quite crucial. Likewise, while it might be contradictory for India to participate in groupings like BRICS and the SCO, it allows the management of its relationships with countries in those groups, such as China and Russia, as I think was seen most recently during the SEO summit with the India-China foreign ministers meeting.
Some of these questions also lead on then to, I think, the final part of our discussion that I wanted to turn to today, and namely that is the question of how does the international community try and manage some of these dynamics that are emerging from the regional issues that Aditya has been highlighting, the geopolitics, the conflicts in key regions. And that is really a question about the future of multilateralism and international governance. If you look at the United Nations today, there's widespread concern that we're seeing a turning away from that organization, there's been a rise of nationalism and national approaches to them, an increasing paralysis often in the Security Council. So how are we going to be able to actually address these emerging security questions in that context? If I could turn to Anise to perhaps respond to this issue as regards the Middle East, which is obviously at the center of a number of very serious conflicts today. it's against the backdrop, as I think, as you've noted, of the relative decline of Western powers and a UN that is often being paralyzed by geopolitical rivalries. So where then are the opportunities to forge a stable new Middle East regional order, and who can really lead on that process?
I think there is definitely a shift away from multilateralism when it comes to finding solutions to crisis in the Middle East. Initiatives have been more driven by specific countries. I mean, France comes to mind, definitely as one of examples of countries that have been leading in this sense, but also groups of small groups of countries which have been coming together outside of our international organization and international institution to try to achieve results in a shorter term and in a more efficient manner. I think this trend is definitely likely to continue moving forward. But I don't think this will necessarily mean that international institution or international fora will be completely irrelevant or sidelined. I think the recent tensions at the UN Security Council between the United States and Iran over snapback is just one indication that there are other countries, there are some countries that still really believe in the role that the international institutions should play and the credibility that they should maintain when it comes to at least, if not solving, mitigating crisis. So I think this is going to be, to continue to be the case. But at the same time, there is growing awareness, I believe, that without a regional security framework, which is driven directly by countries in the Middle East and North Africa, and which is inclusive and collective, it is really, really difficult to envisage a stable Middle East regional order. There certainly will need to be a guarantor, an external one for this framework. The US would have been the obvious example in the past, but obviously that is no longer the case. So I guess the question will be who this guarantor will be and who could play a role that is both credible and effective in addressing the crisis in the Middle East, but also in creating what is missing, which is this regional order. And I think, part of the goal of this program that we are starting is actually to identify what this guarantor could be and what role specific countries or players such as the EU or the UK could play in this sense.
One region that seems particularly interesting in this regard is the Indo-Pacific, which, as we discussed at the start of the discussion today, is a region of growing militarism and confrontation, but we're also seeing a sort of fevered activity around minilateral and multilateralism, new regional formats emerging there. Vera, do you think that if we look at the Indo-Pacific, are we seeing the seeds of a new kind of multilateralism emerging that's being really defined by the 21st century security agenda? And what could be the impact of that development for the wider prospects of international cooperation?
Well, I mean, I think I'd firstly start off by saying that multilateralism in the Indo-Pacific is not dead. If we look at, say, ASEAN, a sub-regional organization for the 10 Southeast Asian countries, the fact that the United States hasn't been present at the annual summits of ASEAN over the last couple of years, and the fact that this has been criticized in particular, shows that countries in the region still really put emphasis and prioritize regional solutions and collaborative solutions. Now, of course, there are criticisms around this. For example, ASEAN has tried to negotiate now for years a code of conduct on the South China Sea with China. That seems to be stalling still. And there are criticisms that having sub-regional groupings like this or multilateral forums like this might not necessarily be effective in affecting change. However, I think at the same time, we see that other kind of formations are coming into effect. So we can see minilaterals, as you say, taking shape. And in Southeast Asia, one of the ways that that has been done is by finding groups of countries that would like to work together on a specific, say, maritime security threat. That so far has been an interesting way in which countries who otherwise, let's say, a 10-level country might still be able to get the ball rolling. And we've seen this, of course, beyond just Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific with ideas like the D10, where democracies, 10 democracies, including some some Asian countries and countries from across the Asia Pacific and Indo-Pacific, come together around a specific issue, a specific security question and challenge that they all share. Now, I think that's an interesting proposal. The question, though, then becomes, how do you decide who is in and who is out? And for those who are out, what do they do? Do they find their own regional grouping or their own specific issue grouping? What does that lead to? Does that lead to a different set of norms? Does that lead to a bifurcation of the system? You know, these are questions that I think have long-term implications. And so when we, within the Indo-Pacific program, look at this region, these are really the questions that we'll be asking. Who sets the agenda? Who are the countries that drive these questions and drive these initiatives? And for those who might not necessarily be on the same page, what are the policy options that they're looking at? And finally, if we draw it back into the domestic context, what are the issues specifically in countries that are preventing potentially a multilateral solution or a regional solution? These are, I think, questions that need to be addressed from both an internal domestic perspective and an external driver perspective. It's always slightly more complicated than it seems on the surface.
Thanks. I think that's a great point to end our discussions today. I'd like to thank all our panelists for their contribution. We've covered a lot of ground. What I take away from the discussion today is that we're experiencing very important shifts in international security. This may not be all entirely new. Some of these issues existed in the past and have existed for a long time, but I think clearly there is a rebalancing of factors taking place and leading to a new agenda emerging. This points to an increasingly complex and volatile international environment, often characterized by rising militarization, intensifying economic and technological contest, and where economic factors are also becoming a part of security. And as I think we've seen, looking particularly at the Middle East and Africa, but other regions as well, the emergence of multi-dimensional conflicts involving many actors. And there are clear risks here for the international security environment around escalation to regional conflicts and state-to-state clashes. I think a second area that we obviously want to be looking at in our work going forward are the risks around the emergence of a fragmented world. UN Secretary General Guterres warned just last week at the UN General Assembly that there is a risk of the world being divided into two, split around the two largest economies, each with its own trade and financial rules, its internet and artificial intelligence capacities, and that this could be also the basis then for geopolitical, strategic, and even military division. So we're seeing in the international environment multiple actors, global powers, regional powers, smaller states, non-state actors that are looking for spaces that are opening up in this changing world to leverage their interests and new technologies. But we're also seeing, I think, as we saw towards the end of our discussion, that multilateralism is adapting and emerging in new forms, and there are opportunities to fashion the kind of multilateral frameworks and approaches that can help to manage these new tensions, mitigate conflicts, and even the rising concerns around major wars emerging. By launching the International Security and Transformation Initiative, we aim to begin a broader conversation about these issues. We look forward to re-engaging with this audience on these questions as we go forward. And I think if you are interested and stimulated by today's discussion, please go to our website and sign up to receive our new newsletter. But for now, I'm pleased to close this discussion and invite our audience to join the next session featuring General David Petraeus, who'll be speaking about really another central actor, the United States, and the future that the United States sees for international peace and security.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our final session of the RUSI International Security in Transformation event. In the previous session, we looked at how key regions around the world are being reshaped by the changes in international security, focusing on the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, Russia, and Africa. In this session, we will focus on maybe the pivotal actor, the United States, and discuss what its security priorities will be moving forward. I'm delighted and honored to be joined by a very special guest, General David Petraeus. He literally does not need a whole lot of introduction, so I will just mention a few interesting parts of his extraordinary biography. General Petraeus is, first of all, Senior Vice President of RUSI, a post he held since 2013. He is partner of KKR and chairman of KKR Global Institute. But of course, what he's most known for is his career of 37 years in the US military, which culminated with 6 consecutive commands, 5 of which were in combat, including command of coalition forces during the surge in Iraq, command of US Central Command, and command of coalition forces in Afghanistan. Following service in his military, he also served as the director of the CIA. So really a lifetime contribution to international defense and security. General Petraeus, welcome, and thank you very much for being with us today.
It's always a pleasure to do something with RUSI. Thanks.
All right, just quickly a few words on the format before we start. First of all, the event is fully on the record. So I will start by asking a few questions to the general. I will then open up to the audience. If you have a question for the general, I'm sure you're all familiar with Zoom by now, so just please write the question in the Q&A box so I can see it, and hopefully I will do my best to raise as many questions as I can. General Petraeus, obviously all eyes are on the outcome of the US elections in November and how these will shape the future peace and security landscape. But independently of the results, do you think continuity mainly defines the US foreign policy when it comes to issues such as the US retrenchment from the Middle East or the growing competition with China?
Not necessarily, actually. First, I think what will be unchanged and will represent continuity are the kinds of challenges and trends in geopolitics that were highlighted by Malcolm and Sir David and the others that have presented during the preceding sessions. Certainly that you will still have a geostrategic situation in which the US is the established power, China is the rising power, a variety of other developments around the world, the resurgence of Russia, the continued threat of Islamist extremism, growing threats in cyberspace in a variety of different ways. And to some degree, continuity in the fact that Americans very much want to see endless wars ended and want to do nation building at home rather than abroad. Also, I think it's important to recognize that in the US, there is a bipartisan consensus that the foreign policy of the US and our partners and allies around the world needs to be firmer when it comes to China. That said, a Biden administration would be a bit more of a return to the more traditional US approach, which values alliances, multilateral organizations, international institutions, norms, values, et cetera, all of which the US and the, if you will, the victorious allies of World War II helped bring into place in the wake of World War II, and also, of course, in the wake of the Great Depression. So I do think there would be a bit more of a return to something, again, a bit more normal. But again, let's recognize as well that under President Obama and even under President Bush, there was a dissatisfaction publicly stated with the inability of our NATO allies all to meet the goals of the Wales Summit and spend the 2% of GDP on defense that was agreed at that summit. There will be continuity additionally, of course, in the fact that there is a bipartisan recognition in the United States of the need to shift priorities. This began with the Obama administration rebalance to Asia, or the pivot to Asia as it was sometimes termed, which is a bit less accurate, less descriptive than rebalance. And that certainly has continued in the Trump administration with enormous emphasis, as was noted by some of the earlier speakers, comments by the US Secretary of Defense, the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy, which talk about the growing importance of the Indo-Pacific and the resurgence of great power rivalry. So again, I think there would be continuity in the world as we see it. And of course, in a context where the world is still overshadowed or seized with the response to a terrible pandemic and the consequential economic collapse in many countries. And many of those countries are by no means, again, out of the woods when it comes to either the pandemic or the economic consequences of it. But certainly a Biden administration would have a somewhat different approach, I think, than would a continuation of a Trump administration or a second Trump administration.
Indeed. Thank you very much for this. I just wanted to get your views, if I may, on developments in two countries you are very familiar with, Iraq and Afghanistan. You commented before about how the US troops withdrawal from Syria raised concern over US commitments to its allies. So I wonder whether you could share your thoughts on whether you see the reduction of US troops in Iraq and Afghanistan as posing similar or even different threats for the US.
Well, my counsel to those who have sought it and has been expressed publicly has been that what we should seek to do in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, perhaps some of the other countries that are fighting Islamist extremists, is to make a sustained commitment. Sustainability being measured in the expenditure of blood and treasure. Sustained mean that we make this commitment for as long as it takes. I do that for a number of different reasons. One is that we have seen what happens when we don't make a sustained commitment, when we pull forces out of a country and we declare that we have ended the quote war and whatever. And I used to raise my hand and say, excuse me, I'm not sure we have ended the war in Iraq. I think we have ended our involvement in the war in Iraq. The war goes on, and if it doesn't turn out well, we may end up being back. And of course, we did have to return. The key, though, is, again, achieving this sustainability feature of this. So again, getting to an absolute minimum, the cost to our country, the coalition, and so forth, when it comes to, again, casualties and also to the cost, the economic cost. But I fear that these are campaigns that will have to be sustained for generation, or maybe with an S on the end. They're not the fight of a decade, much less a few years. And if you don't stay involved, you probably will have to get re-involved, and it will only happen after you have seen a very serious deterioration that forces you to return to engagement. So by that metric, if you measure what we are doing in Afghanistan and Iraq, I'd ask whether the commitment is sufficient to continue to achieve the goals that we have in those different countries. In Iraq, among others, it is the enduring defeat, not just the temporal defeat, but the enduring defeat of the Islamic State. It's also a variety of other objectives having to do with Iran and other actors. In Afghanistan, we went there for a reason. That's where the 9/11 attacks were planned, when Al-Qaeda had a sanctuary in the country that at that time was ruled largely by the Taliban. And we went in there to eliminate that sanctuary and to keep it from being reestablished, something that Al-Qaeda and now, sadly, also the Islamic State have sought to reestablish. And we have stayed to ensure that that is not reestablished. So how low can you go in terms of our forces, our cost, noting that increasingly it has become the enablers, the drones, the precision air attack assets, the fusion of intelligence, et cetera, that has become more important as we are advising, assisting, training, equipping, and enabling host nation forces, but not doing the fighting on the front lines for them. So again, you have to measure it against that. And I really don't know what the envisioned end state is yet relative to what would be a benchmark or some metric of something that is sustainable commitment and is also an adequate commitment to continue to achieve our objectives in those countries.
Thank you very much. I have one more question, if I may, and then I will open
Sure.
up to everyone ask a question. So I just wanted to pick up from a point that was raised earlier by Sir David about the role of non-traditional threats in international competition. And I wonder whether you could share your thoughts on whether you see emerging international competition progressively moving away from kinetic confrontation into other means of competition.
Well, we have seen very much the advent of enormous competition and activity, just ongoing on a daily basis, innumerable times, of course, in cyberspace. This takes the form of cyber attacks, it takes the form of cyber crime, it takes the form of information warfare, some of which is intended to undermine our democratic institutions, sometimes to put a finger on the scales of a particular election, as Russia certainly tried to do. Both of those latter two, of course, in the election of 2016. But there are other areas, of course, in which competition is also fierce. I don't know that I'd say that they're non-traditional. I think there's always been economic competition. There has always been competition in certain areas of trade. There is competition actually anew about the systems of choosing government and also of economics, if you will. It turns out that Francis Fukuyama's brilliant essay back in 1989, I think it was, The End of History, and he defined history, of course, as the evolution of systems to elect governance and run economies. And he predicted, rightly, it turned out, that if you will, the US-led Western sort of liberal democratically elected governance and free market economics would ultimately prevail over the Soviet command economy and Communist Party. And of course, that proved true. It was huge. That journal exploded in its subscribership. He got a book deal. And, it proved true probably for 15 or 20 years, but it is not true now. I think there actually is renewed competition between that particular system that he proclaimed as was the zenith of achievement in that area. And frankly, the way that China governs and has managed its economy. Let's not overlook the fact that no country in history, no reasonably sized country at least, has ever remotely achieved what China achieved in the first 41 years since Deng Xiaoping welcomed the world to China and opened China to business, trade, and so forth, and investment. It's unparalleled. It's nothing remotely approaches that. And I think it's reasonable to then put forward that, we've done a pretty good job of this, they might say, and contrast that with how you're doing. And so I think there is a competition there. I firmly side with Churchill, who, among one of his many quotes, said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. But that said, you cannot deny that there is a legitimate competition ongoing even in that sphere. So again, we do see new domains in which this competition is taking place. First and foremost, cyberspace, which is an entire domain of warfare now. In fact, it's not conceivable to imagine conflict, physical conflict, war, irregular warfare, whatever, not having activity in that domain as it is indeed having activity, say, on the front lines, in the air, at sea, in space, and perhaps subsea. So all of this, I think, means that we have much more complex forms of competition in the future than we have in the past. And that is, I think, a distinctly new feature of not just warfare, but of competition between different states and between different systems.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things we highlighted also in our discussion before, the complexity of conflicts. Absolutely. And when it comes to cyber, I just linked to one of the questions asked by the audience. There was a statement made by Putin, President Vladimir Putin, on the 25th of September about restoring US-Russia cooperation in the field of international cybersecurity. The question is about how realistic is to expect Russia to keep such pact, and is there an opportunity at the moment to develop similar pacts with NATO to reduce areas of potential conflict?
Well, look, I think it's always worth exploring possibilities and potential initiatives and so forth. But for someone who has denied what has been factually established, a bald-faced denial that Russia was at all involved in, again, the interference in the 2016 election, stoking the debates, inflaming them in a frankly very sophisticated manner, which took our intelligence community arguably far too long to really isolate and identify, and then to attribute, and then to blame. And of course, he did seek to put a finger on the scales of that election. He's done the same in some others. He interfered in the Brexit vote. It's well established now. Tried to do the same in a French general election, and so in a number of other cases. Arguably tried to foment a revolution or assassination in Montenegro. So the amount of intervention by Russia has been nothing short of outrageous, astonishing, and absolutely reprehensible. So for the individual who has, without question, been not just aware of all this, but presumably has had to give thumbs up repeatedly and to provide modest resources to enable them, to suggest that now is the time to sit down and cooperate and let's open our books to each other and so forth. And why don't we let each other see each other's code? That's a bit preposterous in my view. That said, if there's something legitimate there, let's go see what it might be. But I'd be very, very careful to expose too much of what it is that we even know, much less what we have the capability of doing, for fear that that could expose sources and methods.
Fair enough. I will tie up two questions. One is about the America First impact on becoming less involved in troubled parts of the world, but also unwilling, if you wish, to uphold international law and peace. And the second one basically asking if a Biden administration would be able to revert what has been done under the America First policy in terms of alliances, arms control, and all the developments we have seen over the past 4 years.
First of all, I would be careful to take the slogan "America First," just at face value. I used to often say, read the tweets, but then follow the troops, follow the money, and follow the policy. And if you did that, for example, you would read about the criticism of our NATO allies for not spending the 2% of GDP, many of them not spending 2% of GDP, some of them not even 1.5% of GDP on defense, as was agreed at the Wales summit. But in the meantime, we put an armored brigade back into Germany. Now it's out further in the east. We, together with our NATO partners, moved forces into the 3 Baltic states. We helped establish 2 new commands. One is logistics to push forces further out to the east than it used to be for the inter-German border standoff during the Cold War. Another new maritime one, or a renewed maritime one, that we felt we didn't need until we saw the resurgent Russia, and on and on. Now, that said, there's now a shift of some forces from Germany. There are other activities, and that's just NATO. The same could have been said until very recently about a number of the other places in which we're engaged. Certainly, the facts are that we intend to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, from the WHO, and there's a variety of other institutions and opportunities. I would contend, for example, that if you are really in search of a coherent and comprehensive foreign policy for China, that you would actually get into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That would be a very powerful geopolitical step, less important, candidly, in terms of American GDP growth or trade, but again, a very important action in terms of this overarching, coherent, and comprehensive approach. I think certainly a President Biden could return the United States to the Paris Climate Accord and has said that he will. Probably would dust off the Trans-Pacific Partnership, even though the candidate of his party in the 2016 election said that she would not be party to it after having campaigned for it for 4 years as Secretary of State. And I think all of us thought that there would be a skillful way to get back to it because of the importance of it in this overarching policy that I described earlier. Certainly we would not leave the World Health Organization. And now I say all this, by the way, noting that there are lots of reasons to be frustrated with a variety of different international organizations, multilateral institutions, as some of the earlier speakers mentioned. They have not lived up to the hopes and aspirations, certainly of those who helped bring them into existence in the years after World War II. And some of them have ended up in a degree of gridlock that is maddening, beyond frustrating, and also very, very seriously frustrating in terms of the actual consequences of not supporting action that those institutions presumably were established to pursue. So again, I do think that elections do matter. By the way, I should note that I am a nonpartisan in the US. I stopped even registering to vote back when I was promoted to 2 stars in 2002. I don't campaign, support, or contribute to candidates of either party, although I do offer advice to those who seek it.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to also take 2 more questions, if I may, from the public, because I think they are also very important. One is related to COVID-19 and the global public health hazard that has put for all of our nations, but also for NATO countries. So the question really relates to what are NATO countries doing to preserve their military capabilities and their power, but also to deal with this, new challenge that was not being addressed before.
Well, the militaries of various countries, including my own, have taken a host of measures to try to, first of all, reduce any spread, to identify it, to identify those who may have been in contact with those who have tested positive, and again, to mitigate the risk of further infection, and to, by all means, drive way down below 1 the reproduction rate, or if you will, the retransmission rate of the virus, and seem to have been fairly successful in this regard. So much so that I would contend that the reduction in readiness, which did suffer a bit in the early months of the pandemic, when we saw an entire aircraft carrier having to be tied up as its crew was quarantined, and a variety of other actions like that, that now the military has figured out how to carry out its day-to-day missions, including the training and maintenance of readiness, which is really what was curtailed. The operations around the world largely were not, with some exceptions, as I mentioned, including the aircraft carrier that had to be docked. So I do think that, again, militaries around the world have figured out how to do this. And of course, a number of the militaries have some very substantial capabilities when it comes to medical capacities and testing, tracing, and disciplined forces and all the rest of that. And by and large, forces that do not have the kinds of pre-existing health conditions that make one particularly vulnerable to the worst effects of contracting the virus. I do think that the response to the pandemic has provided around the world a very interesting set of case studies in strategic leadership. As some RUSI audiences may recall, over the past, I have described this intellectual construct that I've built for strategic leadership, those at the very top. And you have to get the big ideas right. Task number 1, you have to communicate them effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization or the population or unit. You have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas of the campaign, and you have to formally sit down and determine how to refine the big ideas so you can do it again and again and again. What's interesting is that I think the big ideas have largely been agreed. In the US, they were announced by the Center for Disease Control, the CDC. The National Governors Association had a set as well, keeping in mind that in the US, there is very important strategic leadership at state level, since we don't have a federal or national health service, as do many European countries, such as the UK. We have state and, in some cases, municipal health systems, both public and private, and university, et cetera. So governors really matter. And it has been fascinating to watch leaders around the world and then within the 50 states of the United States, as they have or have not exercised the tasks, performed the tasks of a strategic leader. Again, the big ideas are there. It's basically that, if there's community transmission, you have to lock everything down. While you're locked down and breaking that reproduction, that transmission community-wide, you are building your testing, your tracing, your health capabilities. You are also determining the regimes that you will then impose, including wear of masks. When you have 14 down days in terms of infections, you can gradually reopen certain activities while still sheltering the most vulnerable, et cetera. 14 more down days and you can go a little bit further. And along the way, they've adjusted to the reality that masks really do matter. If you can't socially distance and you're indoors in particular, there should be limits on the sizes. Bars, unfortunately, seem to be almost super spreader events in some cases. So they've adjusted these, and you see what's happened in a state like New York, where the governor really seems to have gotten this right. You see it, say, in New Zealand, in Australia. So, and by the way, not just islands out there. I think Denmark is another good example of getting it right and sort of keeping it right. Germany, arguably, although it's got some spread issues right now. But it's fascinating to look at different countries and to recognize, again, despite differing populations and cultures and everything else, which ones have gotten it right. By the way, back to New York, I should just note the governor acknowledged that he should have shut down earlier and should have taken further precautions than they did for the elderly populations in the elder care homes. But beyond that, has really driven this down, along with a couple of the neighboring states, Connecticut and also New Jersey, I think, stand out, perhaps Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So it's fascinating to look at this and to do a case study examination of, again, the performance of strategic leadership. And just to tie this all the way back into what we started, again, what you were really asking about is the big ideas guiding the United States. And I do think that a Biden administration would have a different set of big ideas. The realities geostrategically will be the same, but they'll have a different set of big ideas and principles and so forth to guide them than would a second Trump administration, without having normative views on which might be preferable. But I do think that a Biden administration would be a bit of a return to a more normal US post-World War II approach, which is almost equally Republican and Democratic presidents, as I recall, 6 and 6, I think, and as opposed to the more America first that you referred to in describing the Trump approach.
Well, General Petraeus, I think there is no better way to conclude this, and I'm afraid also that we ran out of time. I personally could continue this for much longer than we had available, but it certainly has been a fascinating conversation. So I wanted, first of all, to just thank you for being with us and for addressing all these questions in a very frank and nuanced manner, covering a lot of ground. I wanted also to thank you for your continued engagement with RUSI, and I really look forward to having you with us again very soon.
Well, look, I'm a big believer in RUSI. I always have been. When I would travel to and from the United States from Iraq or Afghanistan, in addition to stopping in at number 10 in the defense ministry, we would invariably stop in at RUSI because of that regard for your institution.
Thank you so much. And to our audience, I just wanted to thank you for being with us for all this session and for the very, very good question that you raised. I'm sorry for those that I didn't manage to raise. We hopefully will have other opportunities to do so. I hope you enjoyed our first event on international security and transformation. This was obviously just a taste. So if you really want to know what we are going to have in the agenda, in the pipeline, sign up to our newsletter, follow us on social media, and hopefully we will see you very soon.